All right, so in this unit, we're going to look at graphing. Throughout the unit, we'll be looking at 3 different types of graphs. You will not only be reading information from those graphs, you will also be creating your own graphs. So to begin, the first graph we have here on the top right is called a line graph. Line graphs are used to show change over time. So the time that we have on this graph is the days of the week, Monday through Sunday here. And we can see how the number of muffins sold changed throughout the week. It looks like it got higher as we were closer to the weekend. Second type of graph we'll talk about is called a bar graph, and bar graphs are down here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And bar graphs show us different categories, so they compare categories of information. The number of freshmen, the number of sophomores, the number of juniors, the number of seniors. So it's different categories within a whole group. The third type of graph that we'll talk about are called pie graphs or pie charts. They are circular in shape, and pie charts show pieces of a whole. So 50% of the total falls into one category, 30% of the total falls into another, and then you have 10% into those remaining 2 categories. Regardless of the type of graph that you have, there are some key pieces of information that have to be included on that graph. So all graphs must have a title. That title will basically just explain what is in the graph. It's a very short explanation of what is in the graph. Next, we'll have labels, and the labels will be on each of your axes, your X and Y axes. And the label will just tell us what did we measure on that particular axis, or what did we graph on that particular axis. Third is the coordinates, and the coordinates are the individual pieces of data that you collected. So on Monday, how many bagels did you sell? Or on Thursday, how many muffins were sold? The legend is the fourth piece of information, and the legend gives information that's important to the graph. So if you have 3 different lines on one graph, those 3 lines would be different colors, and the legend would tell me that the red line represents one thing, while the blue line represents another thing, while the green line represents yet a third piece of information. And finally, the data is basically all of the information included in the graph. So if you're measuring bagels sold throughout the week, it's every single day the number of bagels sold, and all of that information together would be considered the data. So at the bottom of your paper, you should have this graph. We're actually going to identify all those key parts on this graph. So let's start with the title. On this graph, the title is here, bagels sold throughout the week. And the title basically tells us that the information, the data contained in this graph, is going to tell me about how many bagels were sold throughout the week. The second piece of information that I want to find is the label on this graph, and we have 2 labels. We have the label that tells me the number of bagels sold, and then we have the other label which tells me the day of the week in which those bagels were sold. The next piece of information is the coordinates within this graph, and the coordinates are the individual pieces of information. So this spot right here is one coordinate, and then this spot up here is another coordinate. So each data point is a coordinate within this graph. Fourth, we want to find the legend on this graph, and the legend gives us information about the graph, and the legend is down here at the bottom. This legend is telling us that the 3 different colored lines on the graph represent 3 different types of bagels, a plain bagel, an everything bagel, and a chocolate bagel. So depending on which line you're looking at, that's the information that you're getting. How many of the plain bagel was sold on Monday versus Tuesday versus Wednesday, or so on and so forth. The final thing that we're going to look at on this graph is the data, and all of the information together is the data in this graph. So all of these coordinates, the number of bagels sold on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and the numbers of plain, everything, and chocolate chips sold on those days all together is called the data. So all of the information contained in the graph is the data. not just the individual points, all of the points together are considered the data. Now, one key thing is to make sure that you know the difference between the X and Y axes. So I'd like to take a moment and identify those. The X-axis is down here at the bottom. It's the horizontal axis. And the X-axis is where we graph the independent variable. Remember, the independent variable is the variable that I, the scientist, control or change. So I am deciding to measure bagels on Monday. I am deciding to measure bagels on Tuesday. I am deciding to measure bagels on Wednesday. I am the one changing the day of the week. The other axis is called the y-axis, and that's this vertical axis over here. And what I graph on the y-axis is the dependent variable. And if you remember from the first chapter, the dependent variable is the variable that I'm measuring during the experiment. So I am measuring how many plain bagels I sold. I am measuring how many everything bagels I sold. I am measuring how many chocolate bagels I sold. So that's the information that would go on the y-axis, the number of bagels I sold each day of the week. Throughout this chapter, we are going to be not only reading these different types of graphs, but you're also going to be creating the 3 different types of graphs on your own. So if you have questions about the different pieces of the graph, please make sure to ask in class.